January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the Ardennes forest. Belgium. The snow fell in silence. It did not fall gently, it fell in thick. Gray curtains that muffled the sound of distant artillery and blurred the jagged outlines of burned-out farmhouses. The cold was absolute. It crept through wool and leather, through layers of mud-caked fabric, through the skin itself. In a hastily cleared stone cellar beneath what had once been a schoolhouse, German nurses knelt beside rows of wounded men. Their hands, red and swollen from frostbite, moved mechanically, wrapping gauze that was too thin, applying salves that had long since run out. The air smelled of gangrene and damp stone. Above them, the war rumbled on, indifferent. Outside, American trucks groaned through the frozen mud, their engines coughing in the sub-zero air. From the back of one truck, a young woman in an olive drab uniform climbed down, her breath forming clouds in the still air. She was a nurse with the 128th Evacuation Hospital, part of the American forces that had pushed through the shattered German lines after the collapse of Hitler's final gamble in the West. Her boots crunched on ice as she approached the cellar entrance, a canvas sack slung over her shoulder. She did not know what she would find inside. She knew only that there were wounded, and that the Red Cross emblem painted on the cellar wall meant someone, somewhere, had tried to save them. What happened in that cellar, what passed between exhausted women on opposite sides of a collapsing world, would not make headlines. No journalist recorded it. No camera captured it. But those who were there would carry it for the rest of their lives. Because in that moment, something heavier than ideology cracked open. Something older than the war. To understand what broke in that frozen cellar, you must first understand what the German nurses believed they were fighting for. They had been raised in a Germany reborn. A Germany that had clawed its way out of humiliation, unemployment, and chaos. By 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, the Weimar Republic had become synonymous with disorder, hyperinflation that turned life savings into wastepaper, unemployment that reached 6 million, political violence that turned city streets into battlegrounds. Into this void stepped a man who promised restoration. Not just economic recovery, but spiritual resurrection. The Third Reich, he said, would last 1,000 years. It would be built on discipline, unity, and the purity of the Volk, the people. Women, in this new order, were not to be factory workers or politicians. They were to be mothers and nurses, guardians of the race, keepers of the home front, the German Red Cross nurses who served in field hospitals across Europe had been indoctrinated in this vision. They were part of the NS-Schwesternschaft, the National Socialist Sisterhood, a network of medical professionals bound not only by the Hippocratic Oath, but by loyalty to the Führer. Their training emphasized endurance, obedience, and sacrifice. They were taught that the soldiers they tended were heroes in a cosmic struggle, a struggle not merely for territory, but for the survival of civilization itself against the degenerate forces of Bolshevism, Judaism, and Anglo-American materialism. By 1945, that vision had become a nightmare. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had begun. In June 1941, with supreme confidence, German forces swept across the western USSR in a blitzkrieg that seemed unstoppable. But the war did not end in 3 months, as Hitler had promised. It stretched into winters that froze men alive, into battles that consumed entire armies, into a grinding attrition that turned ideology into ash. The German nurses who followed the Wehrmacht east saw things that shattered the myths of invincibility. They saw frostbite amputations performed without anesthesia. They saw men die of typhus in lice-ridden field hospitals. They saw supply lines collapse, rations dwindle, and the wounded pile up faster than they could be treated, and they were told to endure, to believe, to sacrifice. By the time the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, the German medical corps was already broken. Supplies were critically short. Morphine was rationed to the point of uselessness. Bandages were washed and reused until they fell apart. Food for medical personnel consisted of black bread, watery soup, and ersatz coffee made from roasted barley. The German nurses, many of them in their early 20s, worked 18-hour shifts in freezing cellars and bombed-out buildings. They were hungry. They were exhausted. And they were beginning to realize that everything they had been told was a lie. The American forces that poured into Western Europe after D-Day represented something the German nurses could not have imagined. They had been told that America was a nation of weaklings, a mongrel society, ruled by Jewish financiers and populated by soft, undisciplined civilians who knew nothing of sacrifice. They had been told that American soldiers were cowards who would break at the first sign of real combat. Goebbels' propaganda machine churned out images of decadent, jazz-obsessed G's lounging in luxury while true warriors, German warriors, bled for their homeland. But when the Americans arrived, they brought something that no amount of propaganda could explain away. They brought abundance. The logistical machinery of the United States military in World War II was unprecedented in human history. By 1945, the U.S. Army was supplying millions of troops across 2 oceans with a level of material wealth that seemed almost obscene. Every American soldier in Europe received a daily ration of 4,000 calories, more than twice what the average German civilian was consuming. The standard U.S. field ration included canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate bars, cigarettes, instant coffee, chewing gum, and tinned fruit. Medical supply chains ensured that frontline hospitals never ran out of plasma, sulfa drugs, or morphine. American field hospitals operated with heated tents, electric lighting, and surgical equipment that German doctors could only dream of. This was not the result of superior ideology. It was the result of industrial capacity. By 1944, the United States was producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American factories turned out tanks, planes, ships, and weapons at a rate that made the Axis powers' output look primitive. But more than that, America fed its soldiers. It clothed them. It gave them mail from home, cigarettes, candy, and coffee. It treated them not as expendable components in a racial crusade, but as citizens whose well-being mattered. The German nurses did not know this yet. Not fully, but they were about to learn when the American nurse descended into that cellar in the Ardennes. She carried with her a canvas sack filled with K-rations, chocolate bars, and tins of Spam. She had been ordered to assess the condition of wounded prisoners and determine what medical supplies were needed. What she found was worse than she had expected. The cellar was dim, lit only by a few flickering candles. The smell hit her first, a thick, sour reek of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and human waste. Rows of men lay on thin straw pallets, some unconscious, some staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes. In the corner, 3 German nurses huddled around a small brazier, trying to warm their hands. They looked up as the American entered, their faces gaunt, their uniforms filthy. For a moment, no one moved. The war had taught them to expect cruelty, or at best, indifference. The American nurse set down her sack and knelt beside the nearest wounded man. She checked his pulse, examined the bandages on his leg, old, soaked through with pus. She did not speak German, but she did not need to. She pulled a tin of Spam from her sack, opened it with a small key, and handed it to one of the German nurses. The woman stared at it as if it were something holy. The American nurse pulled out more cans of beef stew, chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper, packets of instant coffee. She distributed them among the 3 German women, then pulled out a box of sulfa powder and a roll of clean gauze. She gestured to the wounded men. Together, they began to work. For the next hour, they moved through the cellar in silence, cleaning wounds, changing bandages, offering sips of water to men too weak to sit up. The German nurses ate as they worked, tearing into the Spam with their fingers, chewing slowly, savoring each bite. One of them, a young blonde woman with hollow cheeks, began to cry. Not loudly, just silent tears that streaked through the grime on her face. The American nurse did not ask why. She knew what the German nurses experienced in that moment was not charity. It was confrontation. They had been told that the Americans were the enemy, that democracy was a sham, that capitalism bred weakness, that the German way of life was superior. But here, in a frozen cellar, surrounded by their own dying soldiers, they were being fed by the very people they had been taught to despise. And the food was real. The medicine was real. The care was real. This was not supposed to happen. In the Nazi worldview, compassion was a racial trait reserved for the Volk, denied to the unworthy. The idea that an American woman, representing a nation of supposed degenerates, would share her rations with German nurses caring for enemy soldiers, this violated every principle the Reich had drilled into them. It suggested something unbearable, that perhaps they had been on the wrong side all along. One of the German nurses, a woman named Greta Fischer, would later recall that moment in a letter written decades after the war. She described the taste of American chocolate as the most painful thing she had ever experienced, not because it was bitter, but because it was sweet, because it reminded her of what she had lost and what she had been denied. She wrote, "I had believed we were the civilized ones. I had believed we were the chosen. But when that American woman handed me food, I realized I had been starving, not just my body, but my soul." This was the quiet collapse of fascism. Not in a grand military defeat, but in a tin of Spam shared in a cellar. Not in a treaty or a speech, but in the recognition that the ideology they had served had betrayed them utterly. The symbolism of food in this encounter cannot be overstated. In Nazi Germany, food had become a weapon. Rationing was imposed early in the war, and by 1945, the average German civilian was subsisting on fewer than 1,500 calories per day. In occupied territories, Poland, the Soviet Union, Greece, the Nazi regime deliberately starved populations it deemed inferior. Millions died of hunger as German authorities requisitioned grain, livestock, and produced to feed their own troops and civilians. The Nazi vision of Lebensraum, living space, was built on the assumption that some people deserved to eat, and others did not. The Americans, by contrast, fought a war of plenty. The U.S. government ensured that its soldiers were the best fed in history. This was not mere logistics, it was philosophy. The idea that every soldier deserved adequate food, medical care, and rest reflected a democratic principle that individuals mattered, that their welfare was not subordinate to abstract notions of destiny or race. The American ration was not just sustenance, it was a statement. And when that statement reached the German nurses in the Ardennes, it shattered something, because hunger does not care about ideology. When you are starving and someone feeds you, your body remembers. It remembers that the hand that fed you was kind, that the enemy you were taught to hate showed you mercy, and that the system you believed in left you to starve. The transformation was not immediate. The war did not end in that cellar. But for the women who were there, something irreversible had occurred. In the weeks that followed, as the Allies advanced into Germany itself, more and more Wehrmacht personnel surrendered. Among them were thousands of nurses, medics, and support staff who had served the Reich faithfully and now found themselves adrift in a ruined nation. American occupation forces established displaced persons camps, field hospitals, and relief stations. The initial orders were strict. Fraternization with Germans was forbidden. But on the ground, among the medics and nurses who had seen the worst of the war, those rules bent. American nurses shared their rations with German civilians. They treated German children for malnutrition and disease. They did not do this because they were ordered to. They did it because they could not look at starving people and do nothing. This, too, was ideology, not fascism or communism, but something older and simpler. The belief that suffering should be alleviated, that hunger should be fed, that wounds should be healed. The German nurses who experienced this kindness carried it with them into the post-war world. Some emigrated. Some stayed in Germany and helped rebuild a shattered medical system. But all of them, in one way or another, had to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had seen. Many could not. The cognitive dissonance was too great. They had been told that sacrifice for the Führer was noble, that hardship proved their superiority. But when American women they had been taught to see as inferior showed them compassion, the entire structure of their belief collapsed. One nurse, interviewed in the 1970s, described it as waking from a long, terrible dream. She said, "We thought we were awake the whole time. We thought we were the enlightened ones, building a better world. But we were asleep. And the war was the nightmare we couldn't escape until it ended." The epilogue of this story is not found in treaties or textbooks. It is found in the small, quiet moments that followed in the years after the war. German and American nurses occasionally crossed paths again, at medical conferences, at reunions, at memorial services. Some rekindled old bonds. Some could not bear to speak of what they had seen. But among those who did, there was a common thread, the recognition that the war had been won and lost not just on battlefields, but in the moral choices made in cellars, field hospitals, and ruined streets. The German nurses who had cried when American women shared their rations had learned something that no propaganda could teach, that humanity does not belong to a race or a nation. It belongs to those who choose to act with compassion, even when ideology tells them not to. That freedom is not just the absence of tyranny, but the presence of care. That abundance is not a sign of weakness, but of strength, the strength to feed not only your own, but those who stand against you. This is the quiet truth that fascism could never answer. It built its empire on the myth of scarcity, that there was not enough for everyone, that only the strong deserved to survive, that compassion was a luxury the right could not afford. But when the war ended, the nations built on that myth lay in ruins. And the nation that had fed its soldiers, healed its wounded, and shared its rations stood victorious, not because it was more ruthless, but because it had never forgotten that people matter. The snow continued to fall over the Ardennes that January. It covered the craters, the wrecked tanks, the frozen bodies of men who would never go home. But in that cellar, for a brief moment, the cold was held at bay. Not by fire or by faith, but by a simple act of mercy. A tin of Spam, a chocolate bar, a roll of gauze, and 3 German nurses who had believed in a 1,000-year empire learned that it could be undone by something as small as kindness. They carried that lesson with them into a new world, a world where the myths of blood and soil had been burned away, leaving only the stubborn, fragile hope that people, when given the chance, might choose to care for one another, not because they were ordered to, not because ideology demanded it, but because, in the end, that is what makes us human. The war had taught them to hate. The peace would teach them to remember why they had once been capable of love, and it began with a can of Spam shared in the dark.